Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University.
This week in the news, the single most important thing to know about financial aid. It's a sham. By Kevin Carey of Slate.com, an explosive article. Our question from a listener: what am I supposed to do if a teacher or outside recommender tells me to write my recommendation and they will sign it? Our interview is with Jon Boeckenstedt, the VP of Enrollment of Oregon State. And this week we will be giving you bonus content, a great interview by Chris McGreal of The Guardian, who's going to be discussing his interview with Michael Thaddeus, the Columbia's professor who exposed how Columbia had been cheating and gaming the U.S. News and World Report rankings. The name of the article is They Are Worthless, and it's an article that last appeared in The Guardian.
So, friends, you have a special listener to thank, and I wish I could acknowledge them by name, but I never asked if I could share the name, so I'm not comfortable doing it. But we got this really cool email that came in this week. Dave hasn't even seen it. But, you know, about half of our emails that have been coming in since we went to our new format have said, love the new format. You picked great people. Awesome. And then about another half are, I miss Dave. And so we got a really big I miss Dave that came in this week and said, I'm missing Dave. I only get once a month. But then they said, the only good part is I savor and enjoy that once a month so much because I know it'll be 4 more weeks before I hear from him again. So I didn't want to puff that already big ego head up too much, so I never forwarded him. But in honor of that special guest who took time to listen, I said, we'll give Dave a double article this week. The thank you for that lovely email you sent in.
Yes, and I'd just like to say to that email listeners, thank you so much for your love and appreciation, and the check is definitely in the mail.
You know, you get some perks from this job. You've got chocolate chip cookies delivered. I remember another listener from Wisconsin, shout out to Jennifer. She sent you like a gift card, and man, you get a lot of perks. You get the $50 gift card. I'm sure you remember Jennifer from Wisconsin was feeling sorry
Absolutely.
for you when you were doing COVID relief in those hospitals, and you got the Chipotle gift card. I think I say that name right. I butcher it all the time. And then
Chipotle.
Yeah. Then throwing some cookies, and now you got people stroking the ego, man. Absence makes the heart grow fonder.
That's right. It's like I'm a Grammy Award or a Academy Award, and you get those little grab bags or those goodie bags. Thank you so much for the love, everybody.
Hey, well, we're gonna thank her and our listeners by giving my admissions tip. And my admissions tip today is really get to know the department's website. So you want to whatever department you're interested in applying to, the major that your department falls under. That thing can be rich. That bad boy is rich. It's rich with a lot of things. One, it's a fantastic way if you're trying to compare schools and you're trying to understand how is a department at your school you're considering different from the departments at other schools. It's a great way to understand distinctions, to understand priorities, to understand philosophy. And it can also give you some really rich content, too, if you're writing one of, these Y essays. And you're looking for something really unique to point out about the school and not just go with boilerplate stuff. So that's my tip for the day is get to know the department website. And I like it whenever I can give you an admissions vernacular that is somewhat, if possible, linked to the content of what we're talking about. And I'm going to do that today. And so the term is financial aid leveraging. What is financial aid leveraging? We're going to hear a lot more about it in a few minutes with Dave and I. But it's a system that uses econometrics, math, comp sci, and psychology to figure out how much financial aid you need to give a student in order to get them to come. And it is rampant in the college world, and it is hush-hush and not talked about. And thanks to Luna sending us in a great article, we're going to be talking about it today. I've wanted to talk about this for so long. I've talked about it here and there with odd comments, but I've actually been looking for an article, and we finally got a great article, so that will be our subject of the day. As for our big number is 4,500. And what is that? That's how many administrators are at Columbia. 4,500 administrators.
Wow.
Three times as many administrators as the number of faculty. And that number has tripled over the last 30 years. So if you go back and look at our past in the news, going all the way back to when I was doing them with Anika for the first, 100 plus episodes, and then since Dave came on board on episode 105, we've had many conversations about why the cost of college is growing so fast, much faster than inflation, certainly faster than the cost of healthcare. And if for those of you who are new or didn't hear those or don't remember them, I'll summarize it in 4 quick points. 1, the rapid rise of administrators. That's one of the main reasons people feel the cost of college has gone up so high. Now, in fairness, here's the other argument. We are trying to provide more services to help kids. So we hear that we need better career services, then we're going to have to beef up our career center. Then you're going to need to have administrators. We hear our mental health's not great enough, then we're going to need to beef up the staff, hire more people. That's going to involve more administrators. We hear that our academic success center is lacking. It doesn't provide the support. Then we're going to have to hire more people, more administrators. So there's a pro-con argument there. So that's the reason 1. The other reason 2, federal and state aid cutting back on money. We know that the Pell Grant has not kept pace with the cost of inflation. Dave and I have talked about that. It used to cover 78% of tuition, room, and board student fees. Now it's covering 28%, but also state appropriations. As education became either seen as big government or as more conservative governors wanted to push for tax cuts, well, you got to take that money from somewhere, so you got to take it from some of your biggest line items. And then you also got things like K-12 education, pensions, police, fire, roads, bridges, all that. Hey, why not pass the cost on to the consumer? Cutting back on aid. And then the arms race. The arms race, that's another reason. So we need more students. Fill in the blank, whatever it is. So guess what? We need better dorms to compete. Very expensive. We need a new student center with the climbing walls and the rock climbing and the Lazy Susans and all that. We got to compete. Guess what? We need more financial aid, need-based and merit-based. Guess what? We need to upgrade our food. These are all things our competitors have. All those things cost money, raise tuition. And then the 4th thing is the government's kind of giving us a blank check because with Parent Plus loans, we can charge the family up to the cost of attendance. And if you're in grad school, the Grad Plus loan lets you borrow up to the cost of attendance. So some combination of those 4 reasons are why people believe that the cost of college has gone up high. That could have been a whole episode, Dave. This is content overload. But the main point here is 4,500 is the big number because administrators tripling at Columbia and tripling in the last 30 years and tripling the number of faculty members. So this is episode where I'm supposed to do my rant and my rave, and I'm holding off my gas on my rant until we talk about the Columbia article. So I'm going to save my fire in, what do they call that in TV media, a tease? A tease, got to keep you coming back for the Columbia article. So I'll hold off my fire there, but I will give my rave. This week I attended a fantastic conference. NCAN is the organization. It's used to be known as the National College Access Network. They've changed the acronym to now mean the National College Attainment Network. But this is an organization that does everything they can to bridge the opportunity gap between the haves and the have-nots. They're on the cutting edge for fighting for double Pell and everything. And so I attended the conference. There were 1,100 people, and they were some of the most passionate advocates of educational equity and opportunity. And I just want to shout out NCAN. If you're looking for an organization to give charitable support to, they're great.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
All right, so this is a great article today. It is Colleges claim to award scholarships based on merit or need. In reality, they're just charging the most they think families will pay. Now, this article, I'm going to go quite in depth in the beginning, starts off with a story of a young man called Ethan. He applied to Ursinus College, a small private liberal arts college located 45 minutes outside of Philadelphia, and he received great news. It said he'd been awarded additional money and to log into his portal to view it. A few days later, he got another letter repeating the offer. And Ursinus College had offered Ethan a gateway scholarship of $35,000 to offset the college's listed price of more than $72,000 for tuition, room, and board. Now, the puzzling thing is that Ethan is not financially needy. One of his parents is an executive for a nonprofit. The other is a public teacher in suburban Maryland. And together, his family earned well over $200,000. So you might think, well, maybe he was a bright light, was a great student. Well, in fact, Ethan's test scores were good and his grades were fine, but he wasn't a star, not in the kind of rigorous advanced placement type classes that are mandatory for admission to selective universities. So, in the meanwhile, while Ethan was getting all these riches, he had another cousin, a high school senior that's referred to as Ashley. In fact, Ashley's academic profile was better than Ethan's. She had higher grades, lots of AP courses, but she wasn't as wealthy. She also lived in Maryland, but her mother, a single parent, dropped out of community college and works at a local restaurant chain. And Ashley's family income is well below the median for someone with college age children. Yet Ashley wasn't getting all these wonderful messages giving her tons of money for college. She got an offer from Penn State, a public university, and when all is said and done, the cost of her attending this college would be $50,000 almost $16,000 more than private Ursinus College wanted to charge her wealthier cousin. So the question is, why the disparity? And what this article alleges is that college financial aid is largely an illusion. Now, government financial aid is real in terms of federal Pell Grants and state appropriations to reduce tuition at public universities, but that aid is often quite inadequate to cover the cost of most colleges. And it is true that a few wealthy institutions do provide financial aid if you can get into them. For example, Harvard and the rest of the Ivies do have need-blind admissions policies so that if your family work makes below a certain level, you can get as much as all of your tuition paid for. And parents can still find good, reasonably priced public options in some states, which allow them to avoid the shell games involving financial aid. States such as North Carolina and the State University of New York are two examples of states that do give very affordable tuition options for their in-state applicants. But if you live in a less generous part of the country and your kids are applying out of state, or they have their sights set on a private college, then the process of getting aid for college is a lot more like walking into, as this article says, a used car dealership than actually getting true merit-based or need-based financial aid. And so before we throw this open, let's go through some of the reasons why. The fact is, according to this article, the large majority of undergraduates attend a college that accepts most or all of their applicants. And while the sticker price for tuition at some institutions exceeds $50,000, the reality is that most colleges don't have enough market power to charge anything close to that. And in fact, the tuition that a college is likely to offer an applicant is based on more how much that college thinks they can get away with and charge each particular applicant than a standardized set of rules based on merit or need. The whole process is something that is called enrollment management, and is a probabilistic strategy for deciding who colleges will admit based on a combination of how much they think the parents are willing to pay and how likely the students are to enroll. So why don't I stop at this part, Mark, and uh, uh, hand it over to you so you can explain more of what this probabilistic strategy is and how, in many ways, in my opinion, it leads to a lot of cynicism about the inflated cost of college and excludes a lot of well-deserving applicants from well-needed financial aid.
Yeah, Dave, this to me is one of the most important in the news we've ever talked about. And if people are really attentive listeners to our podcast, they will have heard me reference this practice. I've probably referenced it 6 or 7 times since we've done the podcast. I know one time I had a book chapter in my book back when we were going through first 171 episodes that were aligned with my book where we talked about it then, but never as in-depth as we're going to do that today. And, it's so funny because, I really pride myself on complete transparency and pulling back the curtain, letting people see how the sausage is made. But even on this topic, I almost feel a little bit like I'm just letting out trade secrets because what we're talking about today is really hush-hush. It's really hush-hush. But it's really important that people understand it. So I'm going to try really hard to unpack it as best I can. Let me start by, giving a bit of background. So I mentioned earlier, I just got back from the NCAN conference, 1,100 access organizations looking at how to bridge the opportunity gap for college. And one of the big topics was FAFSA simplification. Now, we did 3 or 4 episodes on FAFSA simplification with Mark Kantrowitz, which is going to be rolled out in 2024-25 or for the current juniors. And one of the changes that's occurring with the new FAFSA simplification, sure, you're going from over 100 questions to a little more than 30, and there's a lot of other changes. I won't get into all of that. Go back and listen to that interview for that. But one of the big changes is the term EFC is changing to Student Aid Index. And somebody might say, so what? Big deal. Whoopee-doo. That's just semantics. But if I could do a backflip without breaking my back, Dave, I would have done one when I learned about this change. And the reason for it is this. So when somebody completes either a FAFSA or CSS profile, you get something called an EFC. EFC is an acronym that's supposed to stand for Expected Family Contribution. But in reality, it rarely ever reflects what a family pays. So it's a terrible name. So this new name, Student Aid Index, is a much better name because it's going to reflect at least the potential need-based aid that a family is eligible for. So it doesn't imply that's what they're going to get. It's going to imply what they're eligible for. Now, I've said on this podcast many times that less than 4% of colleges meet a family's financial need. Less than 4%. Why? Just because of the extraordinary amount of money that it takes to do that. So then what happens for the other 96% of schools that are unable to meet a family's financial need? And remember, when I say meet a family's financial need, Dave, that's not in the view of the family. That's in the view of whether or not the aid award lines up with what the computers spew out once you complete the FAFSA or the CSS profile. And most people don't agree with that number because they think that number is how in the world do they think that I could pay $50,000? I really feel I can maybe do 20. So this is already questionable. So what happens though to that other 96%? They're not going by formula-driven models to say, okay, we've done a need-based analysis. We've looked at your income. We've looked at your assets. We see you can afford 30. We're going to give you 30. What are they using to determine? So this is the big secret that I want to unpack. And before I actually do it, I thought of an example. I'm going back to the analogies, Dave. Sometimes they fall flat. Sometimes they work. You're the judge.
Well, I'll have to pull out the Anika to give her
yeah.
commentary.
Oh, please don't do that. She's the all-time strictest grader ever. For those of you new to our podcast, Anika and I co-founded the podcast, and she was on the podcast for the first 171 episodes. And I would do these analogies, and she would shoot them down if I 1 out of 10 passed her test.
If you could ever see her rolling her eyes through an audio podcast.
Yeah. So here's an analogy I want to give. So let's say, Nika's used to my guy and the dating analogy. So here we go. Say you're a guy and you're trying to get someone to come to you, go to the prom with you. So you ask somebody and they turn you down. Okay? You ask somebody else and they turn you down. Right? So chances are your best line for the third girl is not to say, please go to the prom with me. I've asked so many girls and they've all said no. Can you please say yes? That's not likely to be your most persuasive line. You're probably better off not letting this potential date know that you're the sixth girl I've asked. Does that make a lot of sense? So how does that relate to financial aid? So in reality, for the majority of these schools that don't meet financial need, but they still need to woo students, the illusion that is out there is that the aid award somebody gets is all about their scholarship. It's all about how strong they were academically. And that's what determines their aid award, other than the need-based analysis. So we know there's two types of money, right? Need-based aid, merit-based aid. So people know, okay, maybe somebody got generous money because the family had a financial need. So that may be one reason why they got the money. Or maybe somebody else got a lot of money because maybe they were like a really strong student or tester or whatever. And that's the public perception. The perception of the public is that people are paying different prices for college. It's not that everybody thinks, well, every kid on this campus paid $30,000. They do understand, and an example I like to use a lot, which is, you're on an airplane. You kind of know the person to the right and the left of you. You're in the middle seat. Probably didn't pay what you paid for the airline ticket. There is that understanding. People are paying different amounts. But the public thinks that different amount is either based off of a need-based analysis or of a merit-based analysis. And I think this article is fantastic. In fact, I'm going to have to come back to some more Slate articles if they're going to write this well. I didn't see a single thing in there. It was inaccurate, and it unearthed a lot of things that most people don't know. So then if it's not based just off of a need-based analysis or a merit-based analysis, what is it based on? And people are, by the way, I don't expect people to get the prom app yet. I'm hoping to connect the dots in a second. So it's based on the fact that most schools cannot afford to give you the aid that you need. They need to give you the aid that they need in order to pay their bills. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So they need to run a net tuition revenue model is oftentimes what it's called, where we need to get $30,000 out of each student in order to pay our bills. Or, the number could be all over the place. It depends on what the cost of your operation is, right? It could be $40,000, it could be $20,000, just depends. So then what does that mean? It means that there is a priority on people who can pay. And so what it means, if you're sitting and looking at two let's say your cost is $60,000 for your school, and you're sitting and looking at one applicant, and they're not going to qualify for any need-based financial aid, and you're looking at another applicant, they can only pay $10,000, and the one that can pay $10,000 is actually stronger. Guess what? That one that pays $10,000 is not going to help me pay my bills. So what I can do to the one that is not as strong, but can do our program, like they'll graduate, they're not going to burn the building up. What if we give them a $20,000 scholarship? We still get $40,000 of net tuition revenue out of them. We can pay our bills. They, meaning the parents, can tell everybody, wow, little Johnny got a $20,000 scholarship. Guess what? It's kind of like a win-win. We get to feel proud of little Johnny. He got a scholarship. He gets to feel proud in front of all of his peers. We get to pay our bills. But this is why I use that prom analogy. They're not going to send out in a letter and say, guess what? we think you're capable of helping us pay our bills, so we're going to give you a discount in order for you to come, even that there were other students that were stronger than you. And, nor should they, right? That would be terrible business. They're still businesses. But the point is, that would be the true story. And do you see how I connected that to the prom analogy, or did I fall flat?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Basically, the colleges have a rolling financial aid admissions process where they gauge how many students they need to enroll at any point in time. And they look at their deficit and they look the pool out there, and they start with the cost of tuition, and they just start discounting based on how much they feel they need to cut their prices to get you to join. And, if they recognize that we thought that we were going to have 50 out of 100 kids take our spots and we only have 40, then for the remaining 10 or however, they just keep on cutting until the people say yes.
Yeah, that's why the used car salesman analogy plays, right? It's like, you want this used car, you're going back and forth with haggling. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that. Quick aside, this last week I got treated to probably one of the nicest dinners I've ever been treated to. I know that bill was over 4 figures. It wasn't just me. But who was doing the treating? It was EAB. EAB is one of the leaders out here. So schools aren't just doing this on their own. They hire organizations like ERB and Ruffalo Noel Levitz. Those are two of the big players, and people who listen regularly have heard me mention them before, and there's others as well. But those are the two leaders in this space. Huge organizations. I'm talking about budgets that rival the College Board. They may have 9-figure budgets. These are huge organizations. I was talking to a college this summer, Dave, and they were just bemoaning how expensive these organizations are.
Yeah.
And this is not a wealthy college. And they told me, Mark, we write them a 7-figure check every year. So this is not being done on their own. This is colleges hiring, these math quants that use these very elaborate, sophisticated models. Now, when I say 7 figures, by the way, they do a lot more than just do projections. Part of what they do is use predictive analytics to figure out who's going to come. Part of what they do is they use all kinds of things. They're studying zip codes. They're studying consumer habit patterns. They're studying the income and assets, and they look at the zip code and the titles and all kinds of things. And it's a combination of psychology and math and to come up with projected numbers of you're going to need to probably give families from this school in this income range X amount of dollars to incentivize them to your school. Part of what these organizations are also doing is they're assessing the brand strength of each individual school. So it's not a one size fits all.
Right.
Like they're not going to say for the exact same, they're not going to target two schools would not target the exact same kid and say, oh, you need to give them $15,000 in merit to get them, because they're going to take into consideration what is our brand strength in the marketplace. And you can know your brand strength in the marketplace by a lot of things. You can look at your yield data.
Yeah.
That's the percentage of people that accept your offer. And then and it's not only just yield data, it's who are you able to yield. You can know, like, okay, that superstar kid at the top of the class, you got a 1% chance at that kid. But this kid over here that's in the middle of the class, you got a such and such chance. So it's very, very complex math, psychology, it's a lot involved. And I've actually seen this with my students. I can think of a student a few years ago, and I'm going to name names. It was Tulane University. The student gets an offer. They don't do anything because they're still looking around. Then they got a $9,000 better offer. They did nothing, Dave. It just a better offer came in the mail. They did nothing, and then then they threw $2,500 more at them. So you can see this is what's going on. Jeffrey Solingo wrote about this in his book, A Year in the Life of College Admissions. He called them, there's the buyers and the sellers. The buyers have to buy kids in order to get them to come. They don't have enough brand strength, so they have to incentivize them with merit scholarships. And so this is what goes on. But colleges don't talk about this because I mean, it really wouldn't be in their best interest to talk about it, right? Like part of what they're relying on is that the combination of every single thing they've done to make, to show you how good of a school they are, coupled with that merit scholarship, that's what gets you over the hump. And by the way, before people are too critical of this practice, there'd be so many more closures if schools didn't do this, because it's just so super competitive out there. And the public has figured out, for most schools, they don't have to pay sticker price. Keep in mind this. I'm gonna resurrect a big number from the past, Dave. 89% of people don't pay sticker price. There's a small number of schools, your daughter happens to be at one of them, Yale. Linda, her daughter happens to be at one of them, University of Chicago. There's a small number of schools that strictly do their assessment of what you have to pay on the basis of need. It's an income and asset assessment of the family. People, we've talked about this before, but I always have to remember, people are starting, all the time, haven't heard all episodes, or even if they've heard all episodes, none of us have perfect memories. Even if they heard everything before, your mind blinks out. You forget things. So this is how the Ivy League was founded in 1946 as a football conference. These schools had traditionally been playing each other in sports, and they'd gotten super aggressive at throwing money after the superstars so they could win games. And then it was just completely out of control. And they said, let's start an athletic league where we can give money if a family needs it, but we can't give money because you're a better running back than the kid that I have right now, so I'm going to throw money at an affluent family. That will not be permissible. And you could not have a school in the Ivy League that started doing that. They'd get booted out of the Ivy League. It's essential to the core, foundational to what it means to be in that league. And then that same concept has spiraled out to about another 30 colleges in the country, all very, very selective with tremendous brand strength. We're talking about places like Georgetown and Stanford and Tufts, and Northwestern, and most of the NESCAC conferences. So a lot of really small schools like Williams and Emerson, Middlebury and Bowdoin, and then you see it with Swarthmore and Haverford. But it's a very small list. You can count this list. This list is about 30 schools in the entire country that have the brand strength to only charge people what the need-based analysis says they can pay.
So to kind of push, but
yeah,
I understand your narrative that you're pushing here, but I think the point of the article was that there's a level of exploitation here because of the lack of transparency, and I really want to get to their core point that what followed the article is they don't really stress this point as much, and it's quote. Understanding the true nature of the college market should reduce some kinds of student stress. If you're a high school graduate in reasonable standing, there are scores of good colleges ready to admit you. But here's the problem, quote, the real market tuition price in the big middle of higher education sector is probably about $25,000, not the $50,000 or $60,000 you have heard. So going to college is not being vetted to an exclusive club. It's simply what they say, another service with a price. But the problem is that because most people aren't aware of this, and because the problem is opaque and not transparent, there is, and I'll quote it, the first generation students with the least money and social capital are most vulnerable to exploitation. And that's one of the reasons why we have, quote, countless individual stories that compose the nation's $1.27 trillion student loan crisis, as many families take choices that lead them crazily in debt because they aren't aware of all the options out there and the fact that what they're paying for their education could be way outsized because they weren't aware of this very arbitrary process that they're being subjected to.
Yeah, so there's that definitely happens, because what happens with families that don't have a lot of money is they're not going to get a lot of these offers unless they're applying to a school that has very generous need-based aid, which is a very small percentage of them, and they're incredibly strong.
Yeah.
It's super competitive to get into those schools. We're talking about schools like, Duke and Northwestern, Emory, a lot of schools I could name, Pomona. These schools are very, very, very hard to get into that have the generous need-based aid. So what happens to the average person, and this, by the way, is a completely race-blind thing. This has nothing to do with race. This is poor whites, poor blacks, poor Latinos, poor Asians, everybody, is they're not going to get a good offer because, one, you're not bringing money to the table for the school, and chances are most of the schools you're getting into are not the super generous ones with the really, really large endowments that can afford to be generous with need-based aid.
Correct.
And you're really in danger of getting seduced by the mindset, by the branding of the school that, gee, I have to pay this price because my kid has to go to this school. That's where good counseling has to come in and say, no, you don't. But oftentimes, go ahead, Dave, you want to say something?
Well, I think it feeds into this cynical narrative that college is increasingly a ripoff. And at a time when more and more people are questioning the value of college, as more and more people are being turned off of college, as the headlines that are dominating are forgiveness of student loans, it's bad for colleges to have a system of tuition that more resembles a used car dealership. For years, the institution that people distrusted and disliked most was car dealerships. Why? Because you never knew the true price of a car. And you knew to get the real price of the car, you had to go and haggle, and you had to be aware, you had to be able to run across the road and check with all the competitors. And most people just had the sense that even when they decide on the price, that probably wasn't the truest lowest price that they could get. It was just the one that they could haggle towards. And so that lack of transparency is really what annoyed people about the used car dealership. There's no difference with colleges now.
I would agree with you, Dave. You don't oftentimes defend colleges, but I can on this one. The only thing that I'll say is there's a couple encouraging trends. One is what's called the tuition reset, and we've talked about this before.
Right.
And when I interviewed Sue Corner, Dean of Admissions at Willamette, I was very happy to go into depth with this. So basically, Willamette, Roanoke College, and many others are doing something which is they're breaking away from the old mindset. The old mindset was the old mindset was a couple things. People are going to think if we're more expensive, we're better.
Right.
That's how the public thinks. The old mindset was we have to watch what our competitors are doing. If they go to 75,000 and we're at 55, people are going to think they're a better school. So we need to watch them very carefully and try to match their pricing. But then we'll just give it back to people in the form of merit scholarships. And so they won't have to pay the full sticker price. They'll end up at a price that hopefully they're comfortable with. They'll still think we're a better school because, wow, they must be a good school. Look at how much they were able to charge. That's the old mindset. The problem with the old mindset is, now this partly aligns with college being diminished a little bit in the eyes of the public, is the public is looking at that sticker price of so many of those schools now, unless it's the strongest brands, because we know there's a lot of money out there in this country and around the world, and people will continue to pay for the strongest brands. But if you're not in that strongest brand category, people are looking at the sticker price, and here's the thing: because they don't know all this stuff is going on behind the scenes, and they're saying, "I'm not even setting foot on your campus because there's no way in the world that you're worth $70,000, so I won't even visit you."
Okay.
So as a result of that, schools have had to do what's called a tuition reset, and the tuition reset is bringing their costs much down to their truer costs. This is why you see schools literally slashing $20,000-$25,000 off their price. You're like, how can they do that? Well, they're still bringing home the same net tuition revenue. They're just not dangling these really big merit scholarships out there. And every admission officer I've talked to that's done this tuition reset basically says we should have done it a while ago, because the trade-off is, yeah, there are going to be some people that think, why is your school 45 and this school 70? They must be better than you. That is a reality. You can't deny that. But there's another group of people that will now set foot on your campus because maybe you look affordable to me.
Yeah.
And so the good news is the trend is toward getting rid of these inflated prices, going closer to true costs, still leaving a little bit of money in there because, people still like to get merit scholarships, but maybe your merit scholarship is $5,000 or $8,000 now instead of $25,000 or $28,000, and that's the trend is all in that direction. And now this is just starting to be a trend, but I predict it will continue as another trend, and we've talked about it on our podcast. It's Ron Lieber, what he's doing with his work, The Price You Pay for College, which is using New York Times and his platform to champion schools like Whitman and like Worcester, College of Worcester in Ohio, and Franklin and Marshall and others that are giving people a true cost. So when you fill out, they're not just doing their price calculators, they're actually looking at full tax returns and saying this is what you'll actually have to pay. So moving more toward transparency and pricing. So if there's good news, Dave, it's that the trend line is moving in that direction.
Yes.
And the more people that do it, the more it puts pressure on others to do it.
And I think it's absolutely essential for colleges to get their pricing in order going forward. We just mentioned how many administrators. If there's 4 or 4.5 times more administrators than there are educators?
Columbia has 4,500 administrators and they have 1,500 faculty members.
Right. That's and we recognize that that's because a college is sort of like a full service facility, and oftentimes
Correct.
we don't see all the services that we ask for.
Correct.
So someone once told me long ago that college was a womb with a view.
I never heard that one, man.
That's right.
Scooped me.
And the reality is it takes a lot of money to provide that warm, incubating, protective environment to your child so that they could survive both financially, economically, emotionally, and otherwise. In other countries, college is just a place where you go in, you take the lectures down, you come back, and you get tested. But we require a lot more of colleges, and subsequently it costs a lot more. But I think the connection has to be made by people of how much it truly does cost and how much they're charging, and that there's not a puffery factor, an inflation figure that's arbitrarily applied just based on whether a college thinks a person will pay it, even if they can't afford to pay it. So I think these are positive trends.
Yeah, I'm a little sympathetic to the colleges, though, Dave, because first of all, a lot of people do think if you're cheaper, you must not be as good. Like, that is not necessarily not true. Yeah. But also, sometimes you can tell somebody too much. Like, if you literally told the truth and you said, the reason why I'm giving you this scholarship is because we need to pay our bills and your family has a lot of money, and we can give you a $20,000 scholarship and we still get $45,000 from your family, and that will allow us to pay our bills. That's not, and if you went around doing that and everybody else is dangling merit scholarships and sending $20 packaging and throwing all kinds of celebrations for the kid, guess who's going to get the kid? That's not a smart way. That's why I use the example of trying to get a prom date by saying, look, I'm really desperate. Everybody keeps saying no to me. Please say yes.
But the problem is, Mark, the perception is it's not fair. What really annoys people is when they feel that their neighbor or someone else is getting a better deal than they are, not based on merit or not based on any sort of positive attribute, just because of arbitrary factors.
Most people don't know this, Dave. This is how secretive it is. We're really exposing something that most people don't know. I agree with that, but the only thing that I'm saying is it's incredibly hard to unilaterally disarm. It's incredibly hard for you to be the one that says, I'm going to buck all the trends and have complete. Now, I think you can have complete transparency about what you're going to actually pay. I think that's a winning move. I think that I think colleges are making a mistake by not doing what the few colleges are doing right now. I realize you need to hire more staff because now you're going to have to evaluate all tax returns. You're going to have to beef up your financial aid office. It's going to take more manpower to go through line by line and look at everybody's taxes and figure out what you actually are going to pay. But I think that's a winner from a marketing standpoint. I'm just saying, being honest with everybody that we're giving you this money because we need your money to pay our bills. That's not a smart move as someone who's done recruitment. Like, people, and if you do it all by yourself and nobody else goes with you, good luck with that one. That's all I'm saying.
Well, the problem is that most people sense that colleges are inflated, and it may not be a smart move on an individual level, but taken together, it feeds into the cynicism that colleges are a ripoff. Look, most people inherently know that mid-market college is not worth $50,000 a year. It's just not worth the return of investment based on the salaries that you're going to make from most of the degrees you're going to garner. Most people just know that in their sense and their being. And the fact is that now that we're just exposing what all people already sense, when they find out, they're like, we knew college was a ripoff. And at a time when it's really almost 50-50 on the amount of people who thinks that colleges are a ripoff, I think it's horrendous for the truth to be known that the average college sticker price of $50,000 is not what most people pay. It's $25,000, and you have to know and game the system or haggle to get down to the $25,000. That's no different from seeing a Volkswagen Rabbit or a car in the dealership at $50,000 and knowing in your heart it's $25,000, but you have to walk on that lot and do all these shenanigans just to get the same price.
Well, let me just say something, Dave. Let's say you're a family, you're making, let's just say $500,000 or more. Okay, so you're in a target market. You have something the schools want. You have revenue. Most of those families don't feel it's a ripoff. They feel, first of all, they could have afforded to pay $70,000 and they're walking away paying $35,000. And by the way, Dave, they don't have to even haggle. The schools aggressively recruit them.
The problem is that's not the families that are being exploited. It's the poor.
That's true.
It's the minorities. It's the uninformed. It's the first generation. It is the most vulnerable members of our society that are being ripped off by the very colleges that espouse a social conscience. And that's unconscionable.
So, Dave, I agree with that. But if you compare our system to other countries, the reason why that other person's not getting ripped off in other countries is because the federal or state government is providing need-based grants like the Excelsior Scholarship in New York. So let's look at what New York is doing. New York is making it eminently affordable for those families not to get ripped off because they're providing incredible, generous need-based grants. Florida is doing the same thing with their Florida Prepaid and Bright Future. So there's places where it's not happening because the money has coming from the state. But what's happened is this country has walked away from taking taxes from their residents and investing it in higher ed. And they've said, you know what, families, parents, you can take out loans and do it on your own. We'd rather give tax cuts and walk away from our commitment there. When you look at what's happening, whether it's Canada, Sweden, Germany, all that stuff, the reason why this is not happening is because of federal and state grant money that most states are not doing in this country.
So there's a term that we use in politics. It's called whataboutism. So anytime that you want to deflect from your culpability on a particular matter, you just go, well, what about this? And what about that?
I don't think that's fair, Dave, because the schools that you're talking about literally don't have the money to give people $30,000 or $40,000. They don't have it. Like, they're working on shoestring budgets.
So,
I mean, you should see some of them are paying. You should see how little adjunct professors are getting paid and how many colleges have moved away from full-time professors that they can't afford to use adjuncts so they can pay them $1,500 to teach a class. So
to wrap this up,
so you just have to be careful about blaming the people that don't have the money.
It's not blaming. What we're pointing out is that for most people, their perception, and I believe it's reality, is that the college system is A, inefficient, B, non-transparent, and 3, quasi-corrupt. It's inefficient because most people don't believe that you need a 3-to-1 administrator to faculty ratio to run a college. B, it's non-transparent because most people don't know how the sausage is made, and the sausage is how it's made is grossly unfair and biased, and exploits people who are the most vulnerable, the least educated, the poorest, the first gen, and B, it's corrupt because fundamentally, any time that you are putting out a $50,000 sticker price and you're really only going to charge $25,000, and you have a system that's just I call it a sucker bait system. Who's the sucker who's actually going to pay it because they don't figure out that they don't have to pay it because they don't know? So all the people who are wealthy enough or thing will give you the $25,000 rebate because we have enough suckers in the system to give the $50,000 to subsidize you who are rich and don't even need it. That is a system that is going to fail. And I think that's one of the reasons why colleges will continue to go out of business and struggle, and should go out of business and struggle, because that is not a sustainable system in our society going forward.
Yeah, I'll just say is, you're taught, most these schools that don't have a lot of money, people are not getting paid a lot to work at these places. I just want to reiterate my point, and maybe we disagree. But if you look at our country compared to all the other countries that are not charging this amount of money for school, they're not charging it because there's a fundamental commitment on either the federal or the state level to invest in the schools. We have walked away from that as a country, and we have said students can take out loans and parents can take out loans. We've categorized education as big government. We don't invest in it, by and large. I mean, you heard the conversation about Pell Grants. I just came from a conference where the whole motto is double Pell. Pell Grant used to cover close to 80% of the cost. Now it's under 30%. That's because of government walking away. And all the small little regional publics and community colleges and all these schools out here that are paying people peanuts to work at them. The people have to do other jobs like on the side because they pay so little. I do not see that as the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is the government walking away from its commitment to invest in its citizens. So, but yeah, I agree. I agree that there needs to be more transparency. Let's table it here, man, because the temperature might get picked up a little too high.
You got it.
Plus, Dave's doing something a little different. I'll be fully transparent with our listeners. Dave's internet sucks at his house, so he's using the internet in the hospital, and pretty soon they're going to boot him off this computer.
That's right. All right. And they're going to think, look at him. He's on his Facebook. All right, Brad.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Okay, Lisa, guess what? No preamble today. We're just going to dive on in. What's your question today?
Wow. Okay. I wasn't ready for that.
I know. I don't blame you.
All right.
I'm always talking about something.
All right. Yeah, I know that never happens. So this question is from Anonymous, and Anonymous asks, what do I do if a teacher or an outside recommending writer tells me to write my own recommendation and they will sign it?
This is such a hard question for me to answer. It's just hard. Like normally, you want to say like you stumped me, you kind of stumped me. Even that I have this happened to me 3 times this year. So I've had to deal with it. It's a reality. I had it last night. How real is that? I had it about 7 or 8 weeks ago and I had it about 3 months ago. So I'm just going to present both sides. So I was so just stumped, I guess is the word I would say, by how to handle this, that I reached out to 3 different senior level high admissions people. I'm not going to mention their names. The only thing I'll say is they've all been on this podcast. They've all been interviewed. One of the nice things about these people I interview is that I have quick go-tos when I have these kinds of things, and it's like above my pay grade. So the way that I worded it to them was, if a teacher says write your own recommendation, or an outside rec says write your own recommendation, so the student they didn't ask for that. This is what the teacher said. This is what the other outside recommendation writer said. When I asked them, I just said teacher only, by the way, when I reached out to these 3 people, but I'm applying it to either one. Now, here's the way I asked it. Is it unethical for the student to do that? Now, what do you think they said, Lisa?
Yes.
Yeah. And why do you think they would say that?
Well, because it's like totally invalid. I have a letter of recommendation. Like I could write myself an amazing letter of recommendation, but that doesn't tell you anything. It's, doesn't tell you an outside opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they don't like it. They feel it crosses an ethical, boundary of impropriety. On the other hand, is it wrong to punish a student who didn't ask the teacher to do that, didn't ask the outside recommendation writer to do that, has built good relationship with them, and they would like for that person to be able to do it? It's a tough one for me. What I said to a family yesterday when this came up was, you need to insist, if you're going to do this, you need to insist that they read everything that you said and they're comfortable with everything. I'm not comfortable with you doing it if somebody literally says either I'm so busy or I trust you so much, just hand it to me and I'll sign it. Like, I can only do this if you read everything over and you can agree with the content. And that's the only way that I'll say I'm personally comfortable with it. It's still hard. It's in this murky middle. Let me ask you, what do you think? Do you think the answer to the student should be no, don't do it? That's not what any school wants? Or do you think it should be like, it's not your fault if you want them and you've built this relationship with them and they've asked you? I mean, just what is your thought? It's really difficult. I can tell you what colleges say. What are your thoughts, Lisa?
Well, I think it kind of depends on who's asking you to do that. Like if it's somebody who's not a teacher, I'm more comfortable with that. So let's say you work, a lot of my students work at a grocery store. Let's say you work at the grocery store and your boss is super busy and they say, just tell them that you're a hard worker and I think you're great. If you write it, I'll sign it. I guess I'm fine with that. If it's a teacher though, I don't feel good about that. I think you got to ask another teacher because I don't think there's no way that a student or even a parent could write a letter of recommendation that's going to sound like it's from a teacher. I don't think, like you just can't make that stuff up. So I feel like that would be not a great letter anyway. And it'd be better just to move on to somebody else.
I said to a student that asked me this yesterday, I said, there's an inherent risk that they can tell that this is not a teacher writing, that this sounds like a 17 or 18-year-old, and you run that risk. Like, schools weren't born yesterday. They do know this happens. So is that a risk that you're willing to take? It's just something for you to think about. It's a hard one. Like, I don't know if I'm comfortable firmly saying you should never do it under any circumstance. I do know the only way I would be comfortable with it is the one condition that I have, if we're going to do this, is that you read every single thing that I said and you agree with it. I don't know if I'm compromising by saying that, but my gut tells me that I don't think it's an ethical violation if somebody imposes that criteria on the situation.
Yeah, it is so kind of because you waive the right to see those. You give up your right to see those letters of recommendation with FERPA when you waive it. And so, like, if you're writing it, that's like really in direct violation of the whole thing.
But here's the thing: you waive your right, but there's still teachers that hand recommendations back to kids. I've done it before.
Mm-hmm.
I'm agnostic on it. I respect your view because I think it's the most ethical view out there. And I do know that teachers would, the fact that schools are not comfortable with it kind of makes me feel uncomfortable with it too. That's maybe, I'm processing everything out loud.
Yeah.
It's a really, really hard question.
It's a really hard thing. It puts, and I mean, I don't know. Like I said, if you're a Girl Scout troop leader asks you to do that, I have no problem with that, because that's a different kind of recommendation. I don't know.
To me, they're the same. Now that's what I'll say. Like, to me, I wouldn't differentiate either I don't see a difference between that personally. I know we disagree on that, but to me, a teacher recommendation, an outside recommendation, either the person's writing it or you're writing it and you're letting them read it and say, do you agree with what I said?
Yeah, but like for most schools, the teacher recommendation is a requirement. and the outside recommender is optional.
That's a
And
difference. That's true.
so, like,
That's
I
true.
feel like for an optional recommendation, okay, fine. But if it's a required element of the application, you know, I'm just like a smidge less comfortable with that. I'm sure
Yeah.
it happens.
Well, I
You
know it happens because it's 3 times I've been asked
Right.
it in the last year.
Mhm.
Well, once was an outside and 2 was teachers. Well, and once a student did it, he actually did it. He's in an Ivy League school right now, so I guess it didn't hurt him.
Well, I guess it worked. I guess you did a very good job, which I guess, is enough. Can you write a letter of recommendation for yourself that sounds authentic? This is a task that will get you into school.
Well, in some ways it's an advantage because I tell them, like, use all these examples that colleges love to see of how you did things. But I don't know. The more I talk about it out loud, I think you're winning me over to your view. I think that if the colleges feel like you just shouldn't do that, I have that perspective. They've told me that. I can't ignore the knowledge that they have bequeathed. I know it's unfair to the student because the student is being somewhat punished because the teacher wanted to take the easy way out. But I used to say this. I haven't said this in a long time. I'm going to say it. A saying I used to try to live by. When in doubt, throw it out. When in doubt, throw it out. And I think this is falling in that bucket of when in doubt, throw it out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
See, Lisa, you persuaded me. You didn't think you could do it.
I definitely thought I could do it. Come on, man. You don't even know what happens that you get persuaded to do around here.
Oh, okay. Smack me in the face.
I'm just going to keep that innocence and naivete going over there.
You just be the neck moving the head.
Exactly. Oh, man. Yeah, no, and it's hard. Like, on the one hand, I say teachers, like, this is your job. On the other hand, I know, like, teachers right now, that they are overwhelmed and underfunded and under-resourced. And I can imagine them just being like, I can't do one more thing. So I understand that.
Well, I was hesitant to take this question because I literally came not really knowing the answer. I really did.
Yeah.
I know I know the college perspective, but I also know the college perspective online. Like, they want all knowledge. Most colleges would want you to submit your low test scores and just say, "Oh, we'll take it into consideration." Like, they like as much knowledge of So I don't always agree with every single thing they always want because they're looking at it from their vantage point. But I think, like, it falls in that category. When in doubt, throw it out. It just does. And so I think after processing, talking out loud, listening to Lisa, talking to 3 admission officers, I think the advice here is find another teacher.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that, and then if you can't, then I guess then we have to figure out something to do. But, hopefully there's
then you have to beg them. Please, pretty please.
Start
what
crying,
can I do?
Bring muffins.
Yeah, I know that it's going to take you a little time. Can I go run an errand for you to save the time?
Let me babysit your kid for you while you do this. But don't worry. If you give me a bad review, I won't hurt them, right? No, it's
the things that people do.
World.
Awesome. Well, Lisa, we'll see you next week.
All right, bye.
Bye.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Okay, friends, hopefully you enjoyed the first part of my interview with Jon Boeckenstedt. It was one of the funnest interviews I know I did, talking about certain admission practices and asking Jon, in your opinion, is this ethical or is it unethical? Well, we continue that same conversation in part 2. Listen and enjoy. And another one, I'm sure you understand what happens you probably don't like, which is an extremely high percentage of the class being taken in ED. Now, what's extremely high? That's subjective, but for this conversation, let's say 60s. Let's say you're taking 60 to 2/3 of your class ED. What are your thoughts on that from a standpoint of, because we know that drives admit rate down. It makes you look more selective. Yep. People think you're better. We know the need to lock in people in multiple constituencies to please stakeholders. So that's a very valid use of it, right? And coaches certainly want to lock people in. So, you can see the arguments both ways. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a double-edged sword. So when I first learned about early decision, and ED is not so popular anymore, so much as early single choice early action, which is a little bit different. But I think ED, in taking 60% of the class, ED is problematic for a couple reasons. First of all, it favors students who have the privilege of saying, I don't need to worry so much about money and cost. So you're automatically going to skew toward that demographic and that group of students, I think. And I think that's really unfortunate. On the other hand, again, I hate to keep saying this, colleges get measured by graduation rates.
Sure.
Right? And I know you're interested in graduation rates also.
Yeah.
And so the way you increase graduation rates is to only enroll students that are really committed and dedicated to enrolling at your institution. And so I'm not blaming students and parents for acting the way they do, so I don't want it to sound like that. But if suddenly the market said to us, we don't care so much about graduation rates anymore, you might see different behavior in the colleges. And the sad reality is these things feed off each other. It's not one group does something and the other responds. It's a constant cycle back and forth, a feedback loop where one thing affects what happens and then what happens affects the other thing in reverse. So I don't like big numbers of ED. I do like the idea of ED for students who are hoping to get a break in the admissions process. I do like ED for a select group of students who want to get maybe the little bump that ED provides and who are really focused on an institution for the right reasons. That might be a very narrow academic program, like Foreign Service at Georgetown or something along those lines, where it's a renowned program, or pre-med at Johns Hopkins, right? And if those students are focused in that regard and have the opportunity to apply ED and get a bump in the admissions process, I'm all in favor of that. I don't know how you make ED so it only serves those students, unfortunately. It's turned into something that more serves colleges than it does students. And you know this because you hear students say, well, I'm going to apply early decision, I just don't know where yet. Right?
Sure.
That's the sign that it's a little bit of a problem to me.
Now, another trend that I've noticed is on the increase, and several of our co-hosts are also college counselors also would concur with this, which is schools, they offer early decision, and now they also add early action to the early decision, which is fine. Obviously, we all agree early action is a lot more student-centric, but they use the early action as a recruiting tool to try to flip people into ED2. And so I was actually talking to a mom in Kentucky, who's also a college counselor, and she had a terrible experience with the school, which I won't name, just to be a little PC.
I bet I know which one it is, though.
Well, I'll give you one. I'll say one thing. It's in Ohio, but so that's the problem. I think I know which one you were thinking.
Yeah,
in another state a little further south, but the one we all think of, but because they've been very open about it, and I'll even name that. That's Tulane. Tulane once said we flipped 195 kids in, whether you want to call it transparent or bragging, however, they've been very open about it. So I'm not talking about them, but the point is, the mom felt the outreach got so aggressive, it was to the point where it was like strong arm tactics. Like if you don't do this, there's not going to be a spot for you, and so. What are your thoughts on kind of that whole thing? ADA to use it as a tool, as a recruiting tool to get an ED2 pool.
When students are faced with that option, I would like to tell them, what will you lose? You will lose maybe a chance to go to this one university that you're kind of interested in, but let's be honest, it's not the only university in the world for you. And if you don't like the way they're treating you as a prospective student, what does that say about the way they might treat you as an enrolled student, right? Right now, they're in kind of the dating process and they're trying to make a good impression on you. And this is how they treat you. I would be, really leery about taking that bait and switching and throwing away your options farther on down the line for, to move from EA to ED2. I would advise students against it unless somehow the ED1 school came back with a deny, right? And ED2, and it really is your second choice, maybe, but I really don't like that tactic at all. Not a good thing. If you're going to have ED1, ED2, and EA, and then regular decision, let them be their own things. Don't manipulate students for your own good.
Are there any tactics I haven't mentioned that are concerning to you, that are kind of on your radar as a way of manipulating numbers to to come across more selective than you really are? Anything come to mind?
One thing that really bothers me is colleges and universities that claim they'll meet 100% of demonstrated financial need.
Yeah.
And that sounds like a wonderful thing to do. And in
Sure.
fact, for a lot of really well-endowed, high-profile institutions, they're 100% on. The challenge is, what does need mean?
Sure.
Right? It can be, as you know, I'm sure, very different from one student to another. Or from one institution to another. So the same student can have very different needs and very different expected family contributions at different institutions. And then the way you meet that need is sometimes a little fuzzy too. So it could be, if you're meeting it with grant aid, like some institutions are doing, fantastic, no argument, no concern whatsoever. But if you're saying a student who might not be able to get a summer job is expected to put in $4,000 from a summer job, or you're expected to take out a PLUS loan to meet the need, or you're expected to take out huge loans and, a lot of self-help in there, I think that's a little bit misleading. And I think it gives students false hope, especially the students who need that hope the most. So I'm often troubled when I hear institutions talk about being quote unquote need blind and meeting full need. I don't know that there is such a thing as a need blind institution. And I don't know that meeting full need means the same thing from every institution to another.
No, I think that's really, really important. And I don't know if you know Peter Van Buskirk, if you know that name from back. You do?
I do.
So, yeah. So Peter was on our podcast probably in year one, and he hit this point really hard that don't tell me you're need blind, because are you need blind for transfers? Are you need blind for your wait list? Are you need blind for your international students? Are you only need blind because you are targeting affluent areas in your recruitment?
Right.
And you can't be a little bit pregnant. So he hit it really hard. And if you're not for all these conditions, then so that's kind of one of the points you're mentioning. But you're also bringing out another point, when is one of it really kind of grinds my gears, which is people want so much to be on that list because, well, there's a little bit of stature with being put in that group, and then it sounds really good from a marketing standpoint, but you are really manipulating the data. And one of the biggest ways I see it is there's schools that take 100% of home equity and they use it in their formula because, of course, this profile uses home equity.
Yep.
Even from your primary home, not like the FAFSA, right? And so and I've used examples. I mean, and you've got some people that live in places where the real estate's blown up. You could literally have a $90,000 income with some schools, and some schools could turn around and with the highest sticker prices in the country and say you don't qualify for financial aid because they're using all your home equity.
Right.
And they have a point. The person with $1 million of home equity is not the same as somebody with no home equity. Those are two different people.
Yes.
I get that point, but turning around and expecting a family that makes 90 to pay 75,000 when they heard you say you meet full demonstrated need, and then net price calculators, people don't stand behind them and they're not all accurate. It's just very problematic.
Yeah. And to the earlier point about Peter Van Buskirk and his comments about being need blind, I think there's another element too. So it's not just that you might not be need blind for transfers or international students or students off the wait list, for instance, even. But, I've campaigned unsuccessfully to change the phrase need blind to FAFSA-blind. Which really means the admissions officer doesn't look at the results of the FAFSA. Because if you've read applications in your life, you can see need on virtually every single line of that application.
Sure.
Right? It doesn't have to be an income amount. You can see need if the parents both work in custodians at the local high school. Right? There's going to be need there. You can see need if the student goes to a school that doesn't offer AP or advanced or honors classes. Right? And if your admissions process favors students who have those backgrounds, you're not need blind. When we used to use SAT scores, SAT means you're not need blind. If your average SAT is in the 1500s, you're not need blind. If you give more weight and credence to the captain of the lacrosse team than you give to the student who works 15 hours a week at Subway, you're not need blind. Right. And so, like I said, you can see need in every line of every application. And it's naive, in addition to being disingenuous, to say we don't consider need in our process.
No, I love it. I love it. That's fantastic.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, one of the hardest things for students and parents is to get a sense of how hard are various schools to be admitted at. You kind of get a general sense from what you hear, and maybe you look up admit rate data, but you've heard us say that admit rate data can be manipulated. So one source that I found, it gives a pretty good gauge of what schools are the most competitive, and it's our recommended resource for episode 260. It's something that Bethesda Magazine produces every year in their college edition. All you need to do is Google, here are the colleges where Bethesda area high school grads applied, got accepted, and enrolled. And the current 2022 edition just came out on the 13th of September. And when you do this, you'll see 6 colleges from the greater Bethesda area, and you'll see admissions decisions for these graduates. And the high schools are Bethesda Chevy Chase, Walt Whitman, Walter Johnson, Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, Potomac, and Richard Montgomery, and S. Thomas Wooten in Rockville. Oh, and also Montgomery, Blair, and Silver Spring. This is bringing back memories because when I used to do admissions and do recruitment travel, I'd visit some of these places. But when you pull it up, you literally see hundreds of decisions. And it's just a really good opportunity to get a sense of that. Now, what you won't see is scattergram data, such as plots that intersect test scores and GPAs like you'll see in a scattergram. But the numbers are so high that it provides interesting statistical information. And then they have a summary of all of the schools, and you can see how many were admitted. And so it's a really good chance. So when you look at numbers, for example, a place like Duke, it's kind of insane looking at just how many people applied versus got in and enrolled. And you'll see just how competitive it is versus some other schools. You can also see the opposite. You can see some schools that pretend to be super competitive, and the data indicates that maybe they're not as much. So for those data geeks, nerds, research people, I think you'll find it worth checking out. And it's a recommended resource for episode 260. Now return to my interview with Jon Boeckenstedt. I want to turn my attention now to a quote from you, and you can correct me if I get a little off. I've actually used it before on the podcast, and one of our listeners, Rob from Texas, wrote in and said, "Can you elaborate more on what Jon Boeckenstedt meant?" So you've said something fairly close to, and I've supported it. Graduation rates are more input data than output metrics, and I love that, but can you elaborate on that? Because that's not how the public thinks. So explain to our listeners what you meant by saying that.
Sure. So there's actually a blog post on Higher Ed Data Stories about this. And I don't know how much, I know your listeners are sophisticated and smart and educated. So usually if a social scientist can get an R squared of 0.3 between two values, they think they've really hit on something big, right? I can predict the graduation rate of a 4-year college university with an R squared of about 0.87 to 0.9 looking at one variable, which is the average SAT score of the incoming freshman class. And then when you roll in selectivity, it goes up even farther.
And I'm sure if you just looked at family income, if you had just that alone, there'd be really high correlation.
Absolutely, positively. And in fact, the thing about where the SAT doesn't predict anything for an individual student, family income for an individual student does predict an awful lot, and it's really helpful. But we don't have that in federal data, so that's not available. But when you're admitting students with uniformly high SATs, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're all smart and therefore they're going to graduate from college. It usually means they're white or Asian, which usually means that their parents are higher income, which usually means that their parents are college graduates. So you roll into that one number of the SAT scores, all those factors which positively predict your propensity to graduate from college. If you're a high school student and both of your parents went to college, it's almost certain you're going to college, right? And you've grown up in an environment that values that and treasures that, and that's going to be an important thing to you. More importantly, if you're looking at all those factors, either consciously or subconsciously, and you're admitting 10 or 12 or 15% of your applications, what it really means is you're not taking any risks in the admissions process, right? You're saying we are only going to admit those students who are kind of destined or driven to graduate from college. If you're admitting 70% of your applicants, you don't know which ones, but there are some students in there who are probably going to have financial challenges, academic challenges, personal challenges, some of whom they might have children themselves, right? Which weigh on your ability to graduate from college. And so it's really a matter of whom you admit in the first place that determines what your graduation rate is going to be. It's not anything magical that happens at these high graduation rate communities, although there's a little of that. Right. I mean, there is some aura and an atmosphere and other sorts of things that drive student success, but it's far, far less than people would have you believe it is. And so graduation rates are an input, not an output.
And I want to get to your higher ed data stories, which you referenced in a second, which is really important. And I really want our listeners to understand it. I have promoted it before, but just in like a 90-second blurb. And so I want to do a deeper dive into that. But I do have a follow-up question for you. Because graduation rates is something that's very important to families. They see it as almost like an ROI stat, right? If I'm going to invest this money, I want to know that, you're not going to drop out on me. And so graduation rates feels like it's a good way for them to ascertain that. You've already explicated why it's, faulty the way it's used. But my question is there a responsible way for a family to use graduation rate data if that's something important to them? And if there is, how would you recommend they go about doing that? And I don't know, maybe that's a segue to your higher ed data stories. I'm not sure, but I know you take it where you want to go.
It is. I did a blog post about this quite a while ago, but I think it's still really interesting. So take a look at the average student going into college at college X, Y, or Z, right? That student and that student's parents probably believes they're going to graduate from that institution. There are exceptions, of course, but by and large, you say, we're sending you here to college and you're going to graduate. So go into the federal data and look at that institution's 4-year graduation rate and look at the institution's 6-year graduation rate. And then divide the 4-year graduation rate by the 6-year graduation rate and say, if I graduate, what's the chance that I'm going to graduate in 4 years? And I think that's a far better indicator of what that college or university is doing from a student-focused and student-centered standpoint in order to get students through in a timely manner. Mm-hmm. And that 4-year versus 6-year rates is a big component of ROI. Obviously, you'd rather graduate in 4 years. Now, here at Oregon State, we have, we're heavy in engineering. and engineering degrees typically take 5 years.
Yeah.
And so our 4-year graduation rate is lower than we might like, but it bounces up at 5 years precisely because of that. And so there is a little bit of nuance and understanding of what has to happen in order to make those numbers helpful. But if you assume you're going to graduate from the institution, don't worry about your chances of dropping out. Worry about your chances of graduating in 4 years versus 6. And I think that's when graduation rates are really helpful.
Now, how does that account for the fact that some schools, let's just use a large group, for example, the Cal States, have a lot of part-time students, non-traditional students, people working full-time? How does that get factored in with, using the approach that you're saying? Because sounds like they wouldn't catch that, and it could lead to misleading inferences.
Yeah, those students typically wouldn't be included in the first-year cohort. So
Okay.
IPEDS considers a first-year cohort to be full-time, first-time degree seeking. So it's kind of a disservice that we don't measure graduation rates of transfer students. It's kind of a disservice that we don't measure, 8-year graduation rates of part-time students. It's kind of a disservice that we don't measure graduation rates for anybody who's taken a few classes and doesn't come in as a freshman. But when you think about how hard it would be to calculate those sort of things, it makes sense that we can't do it. Because transfer students sometimes come in with 1 year of credit or 2 years of credit or 3 years of credit. How do you determine when that student should graduate and whether or not he or she is successful? So it gets really hard to figure out, unfortunately. But to answer your question, part-time students aren't considered in the calculation formula.
Actually, that's a good segue. Why don't you talk to our listeners about why IPEDS data is just a treasure trove of information and some of the most reliable data that's out there? And then that's probably a good segue into higher ed data stories, which I know uses that as a basis for the blog posts.
For most of it, yeah. So IPEDS is the integrated post-secondary education data system of the federal government. And the law requires that any institution that receives Title IV funds, which is almost all of the institutions you can think of off the top of your head in this country, report data usually 3 times a year. There are three or four different cycles when you report data. So you report admissions data on one cycle, finance data on another, faculty and human resource data on another cycle, et cetera. And you can go in, not easily always, but you can go into the iPad system and download the information just into an Excel file. So, if you just wanted to look at public institutions in the state of Illinois, you could specify that. Click the variables that you want to do, whether it's admission rate or endowment values or graduation rates or faculty salaries or anything. Download it onto your computer in Excel and start manipulating and taking a look at it. That's the good thing about IPEDS. The bad thing about IPEDS is that the government is pretty slow in putting that data out.
Sure.
So, for instance, the most recent data that's available, I haven't looked in a couple of weeks, but the most recent admissions data that's available is for fall 2020. And fall 2021 should be coming out pretty soon, I hope. But even when it does, it's already a year old, almost 2 years old. So it's good in that it's available. It's bad that it's slow, but it's also good in that trends usually don't change too much over time. There's when I take a look at longitudinal data, sometimes over 20 years, things in higher education change pretty slowly. They don't suddenly change overnight. So you can take a look at the admit rate from 2020 and assume it's going to be pretty similar for fall 2021, COVID notwithstanding.
Thank you for that.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Okay, friends, we promised you a double episode today. This one won't be as long. Dave and I kind of got into it there. But this is a really important topic of what's going on with Columbia and dropping from, just 18
to 3 to 18.
Yeah. So just a little bit of history. So you go back to like 1998, Columbia was at 18th in the U.S. News rankings. And slowly over time, They cracked the top 5. I think it was 2010, the first cracked the top 5. And then they've just been climbing up, 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 up ever since. Well, and we've talked about this before, but once again, not everybody's heard every episode. Matthew Thaddeus, math professor at Columbia, he started looking at some numbers. And he started finding such massive inconsistencies in the data that Columbia was reporting. You know, they would be reporting, for example, how many classes had under 20. And it was a joke because he worked there and he knew there's just no way this is accurate. Or how much they're spending per pupil on each student and how they were literally counting hospital care and things like that in their numbers. And so he exposed them. And he didn't expose them because he was trying to sabotage his own university. This article, which, by the way, Dave sent me, it's a great article. We'll link it in the show notes. It came out in The Guardian, and it's called Columbia Whistleblower on Exposing College Rankings. They Are Worthless, by Chris McGreal of The Guardian. It came out on September 16th. And what Chris McGreal does is he goes back and he interviews Michael Thaddeus. And remember I said I'm going to save my punch for what's grinding my gears? What's grinding my gears is Columbia, Dave, because even that they got busted on this, they're still not coming clean. And this is what Thaddeus brings out in this. He said, I went back and forth on whether to even share what I had learned. But I got I got so stonewalled by the administration and encountered such a lack of transparency that I'm exposing this to show how bogus the rankings are. It's not about trying to tear Columbia down. And then Thaddeus goes off in this interview because basically what he says, and I agree with him, and that's why Columbia's grinding my gears right now. He says, guess what? They're still not being transparent. They're not admitting this was an intentional error. This was an intentional strategy to climb the rankings. They're making it sound like, oh, I'm so sorry that our record keeping was a little bit inaccurate and we need to tighten things up a little bit there. And he says, no, they're still not getting it. And so that's the essence of this. And I think worse things are going to come for Columbia because once you start to open this up, more people start looking behind that hood. Yeah. But more than anything, what this has done is it's really caused at least some people, Dave, we've been doing this as long as I've been doing 23 years. I've been doing this, saying the rankings are completely bogus. They're a bunch of malarkey, a bunch of twaddle. And that's what I believe. Yeah. Because how can you can rank certain things. You can rank what schools are the hardest to get into. You can do that. Okay. You can rank what schools are the most diverse. You can rank certain things. But for you to say school A is better than school B, and you're ranked 5 and you're ranked 8, by what criteria? Well, I'm the one who's going to judge what's important to me, and my value system is never going to align with the point system that you line. I like to use the example. You can pick up these books, Best 331 Places to Live. And, sorry, I hope you're not out there, but sorry if you're in Fargo or someplace. Oftentimes those places are number 1. Well, that's according to their point system. I don't want to live in Fargo. Sorry, Fargo. I'm sure you're nice and I haven't even been there, but I just don't. So that's what happens with these systems. And this article to me is really interesting because Columbia is not done with their problems because they're still masquerading and they're still pretending it was a technical error. And it's very obvious that it was an intentional error. And so Thaddeus is basically saying, I wasn't going to speak up, but until they're transparent, I'm going to keep speaking up. Okay, I'm going to read this quote. It's a little lengthier, Dave, but it will help people see the flavor of what's going on. When Thaddeus began to suspect Columbia's numbers didn't add up, he saw the opportunity to discredit a system he regards as a con, perpetuated on prospective students desperate to ensure the tens of thousands of dollars a year many will spend on gigantic tuition fees are worth it. The U.S. news rankings, alongside less influential ones like the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and other publications, have a significant impact on which universities prospective students favor. Thaddeus said Columbia's fall exposes the shoddiness of a system that relies on an institution's own numbers without even checking them. I've long believed that all university rankings are essentially worthless. They're based on data that have very little to do with academic merit of an institution. And that data might not even be accurate in the first place, he said. He said it was never my objective to knock Columbia down in the rankings. A better outcome would be if the rankings themselves are knocked down and people just stopped reading them, stopped talking about them, stopped taking them seriously. It's not the first scandal involving U.S. News either. Goes on to talk about, we talked about this on the podcast, Temple's University's business school director is in prison right now for the fraud that he perpetuated on their online MBA. And it says, Thaddeus, who has taught at Columbia for 24 years, also has another target in his sights, his own university's administration. The former head of Columbia's math department described an expanding and self-replicating bureaucracy that is growing ever more expensive to maintain. He said Columbia's endowment is not large enough to cover the cost of the growing administration, and so it's paid for by increasing tuition costs. It means our educational programs have to be run by some degree as money-making ventures. That is the secret that can't be openly acknowledged to the public. Thaddeus suspects administrators rig the data to move the university up the rankings in order to justify the rising tuition fees, which, by the way, tuition is at $65,000 just tuition this year, more than 5 times the amount paid by the parents of students in the 80s. It is clear that the growing university's bureaucracies and administration has been a major driver of the cost of education. And it talks about growing the administrators up to 4,500, which we talked about before. He said what is less clear is what are all these administrators are actually doing. They say that administrators are needed to comply with government regulations. There may be some truth to that, but not much, because these regulations in question were enacted decades ago. That is acknowledged that there was a need for more staff to provide services that were not previously available, such as extensive career placement, more mental health counseling, psychiatric care, but he does not believe that that accounts for the growth of the bureaucracy. And then he says, I was kind of radicalized by the experience of being a department chair from 2017 to 2020. That's when I saw how secretive, autocratic Columbia's administration is. And by the way, they do not share information on the common data set. They're one of the few that don't do that. How they never share relevant information with faculty or students or the public. This episode has seriously damaged their credibility, and that saddens me. But it's also important that these issues get out there. And then Thaddeus said, initially, he was not willing to accuse the university of deliberately manipulating the ranking system. When I first wrote my article, I expressed great agnosticism on this point. But the university's response, including its failure to be transparent about how the false data came to be reported, caused him to believe that Columbia deliberately gamed the system. And there's been no move by the university to commission an external investigation, an investigation at arm's length by a third party, such as a law firm, which is standard practice when a ranking scandals erupt. If I had seen some move like that by the university, I would become more inclined to think the errors were honest and inadvertent, but they refused to bring in an outside third party. So that's the essence of it. Dave, any comments?
Yeah, bottom line is I think what Thaddeus is pointing to is that the analogy I would make with university rankings is similar to competitive cycling along the time of
where are we going?
Armstrong.
I hope you're not talking about yourself, because Dave likes to try to get out there and pedal on his bike with Lake Michigan there. And I don't want him coming on here with all the bravado, because off the air he tells me how the young bucks just fly by him like he's an old man.
Oh, no. This is not similar to that. But when Lance Armstrong, how basically most people knew that competitive cycling was corrupt, that the system
true.
Was juiced. But we put the blinders on because we didn't want to think that the only way to succeed was to cheat the system. Well, there was a follow-up article by CNN written by David Peary. It's called What Columbia's College Ranking Debacle Reveals. And in it, Peary, and I'm just going to quote him.
No, that's a good article. Yeah. Dave sent me that one too. What? Yeah, you want to post some quotes on that one? It was a good one too.
And this quote, everyone in higher education knows that these rankings don't really measure true quality, that cheating is rampant among many different schools, and that even schools that report accurate data still try to game the ranking system. And it says, in fact, both journalism and scholarship on deceptive reporting to rise in the U.S. News rankings, which debuted in 1983, dates back to at least the 1990s. The stakes are high for schools, with some scholarships noting a correlation between rising in the ranks and selectivity, as well as a rise in tuition. And he ended up by saying, the con men run the game, but it's the only game in town. And so what this points at, it's not just Columbia. I truly believe that this is the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, Dave, look how many people, we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
Columbia's been busted, Temple's been busted, Emory's been busted, Wake Forest has been busted. I mean, there have been so many schools that have been caught.
Right.
And it's hard to get caught.
Right. It's hard to get caught because there is absolutely no system for confirming the data. U.S. News does not confirm the data, does not validate it, and makes no effort to do so. The only time that it's caught is by some type of self-revelatory process or some accidental exposure. And then U.S. News is, we never even imagined. Where in reality, I believe that U.S. News knows that everybody is juicing their data. And
I'll walk that back a little bit. They do have an attempt at some quality control, but it's weak.
It's very weak.
Yeah. And it's hard. It would be like saying, can Brown University tell if every single kid did all these extracurriculars they put on their, they're trying as hard as anybody I know out here. They've really gotten tough compared to what they used to. But how in the world, are you going to hire a team of private investigators to find out if this kid put 30 hours in when maybe they did 3?
That's right.
It's all but impossible to so they are in an impossible task to check all the data for all of these schools. But given it's such a high stakes game, like you said, it's the only game in town, there's so many incentives for people to cut corners here and there.
There is. And at the end of the day, people in the know, like you and I and so forth, realize that A, rankings are arbitrary, and B, they're completely useless for assessing what we always say in this podcast, which is the fit of a college for any one individual.
But Dave, I have to tell you this. I cannot tell you how many times, and you know how I feel, and when I'm working with students, I might spend 25 hours with a family.
Yeah.
I still have families, when they get down to 3 or 4 options, will come back to me and say, this one is the higher ranked one. So they they still have a lot of power.
Right.
And my question for you is, do you think it's possible that they can be so undermined that they can get to the point where they're seen almost like the National Enquirer headlines when you're at the shopping market and you go by and you see something, Michelle Obama just gave birth to triplets, and that's some sensational story and it's just bogus?
Well, unfortunately, I think that the ranking perception is here to stay because of the transformation of college, not from an education to be attained, but as some type of Gucci bag or status symbol to be worn.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. I was reading, my wife was doing this thing on Hermes purses, and I was shocked to find out that some Hermes purses, that's Hermes, I'm probably pronouncing it right, can go up to $500,000 for a purse that probably isn't worth more than a couple $100 in leather.
But there's probably a market just because someone can say, I'm successful, I have it on my shoulder, look at me.
That's correct. And what they'll do is they'll only produce 5 purses and they'll set a price of $500,000, and people will buy that purse solely because there's only 5 of them and it's $500,000, just because they can. And I think that there's such a status symbol transformation of the perception of college that's what's sustaining a lot of these rankings, even though everybody knows it's bogus. We all know it's bogus, but people want to say I went to number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you have to get past that total bogus mindset and back to what the real purpose of college is. And that is to educate you and to help you realize your vision in life. And once you realize that, you realize it's a total disconnect from the rankings. The rankings mean nothing about that. And that for all those people who want to buy an Hermes purse, go knock yourself out. But I'm here for my knapsack because it's going to take my books on my back and get me where I need to go.
I think that's a fantastic example. I think that's very powerful, the Hermes purse.
Yeah.
And maybe you got me saying it wrong now. You see, I don't live in that world.
Yeah,
I don't
it's
know how to
probably
pronounce it.
Hermes. I don't know.
Yeah.
At least it's not Hermes.
Probably a French accent or something. But I think that's really apropos. And also, by the way, I don't mean to imply that all schools are exactly equal. I'm not trying to say that. There are certain schools that have more resources. There are certain schools that have stronger professors. There are certain stronger departments and departments in your area of interest. You know, I had somebody the other day say something to me I really liked. You know, I ask all my families how important are rankings. And I really like it when I get this answer. Overall rankings are not that important to me, but the strength of the department in the area that my child chooses to pursue, that is important. And I think that's fair. But I don't mean to imply that certain things like selectivity don't matter, because I actually do believe selectivity does matter. I believe the kids that you're around can help you, and college is not just being in class 15 hours a day, especially in a residential setting. You're going to be surrounded by a group of peers, and they can have influence on you. And but that's not just only academics; it's also their character. But anyway, I think we've beat this up badly enough. But it's something we're going to return to again and again. It sounds like you have another comment you want to make.
One thing, I did find a ranking system that was interesting. I sent it to you, and I just want to throw this out here because this is an interesting use of a ranking. And it was by the Washington Monthly. It was put out August 28th, and it's America's Best and Worst Colleges for Vocational Certificates. And what was interesting about this ranking is it looked at certificates that you could get in 2 years and looked at the amount of money that each one of these certificates could gain, and found that many of the certificates, like medical assistant, HVAC, and air conditioning.
Hey, Dave, I just thought about something, man. Maybe we need to come back and make that an in the news, man. You might be stealing too much thunder. That might be too good for a little side comment.
Well, okay. Well, then let's just throw this out there for it. But I'll just say one thing. It was very interesting because it said that graduates from top-ranked health diagnostic programs earned almost $87,000 annually, and so they ranked highly. Where it says graduates from cosmetology programs often only made like $30,000, so it went very low on the list. But it was a very practical ranking. So I'll just leave that.
Well, Dave, this is also a good segue because Susan and I are talking about something very similar in our In the News next week.
Yeah.
An article that multiple people sent in to us that looked at a bunch of college degrees where people were not better off, getting them versus going to high school.
Right.
And so we're going to kind of continue on the same theme next week, although we'll come at it from a couple different angles.
Okay.
This is an ongoing conversation. College, for most people, college and your mortgage are your two biggest expenses.
Right.
Those are the two biggest line items of what you'll spend in your life for most people. Now, it doesn't have to be. You can go to community college, get your 2 years, transfer into a 4-year public, walk away, or you can stay at home, or you can, some people have grandparent money, or some people have, there's a lot of ways to do college.
Right.
But if you're looking for the traditional go live in the dorms experience, that's usually, unless you're getting significant scholarship money, that's anywhere from $30,000 to $90,000 right now.
Absolutely.
And that 30 could be more money to the family than 90 is to another family, because we know it's all relevant. If you make 900, 90 is very doable. If you make 60, 30 is pretty tough. Well, thanks, Dave. We had a double episode, man. It's pretty good stuff.
Sounds great, my friend.
We'll see you next month.
I will see you soon. Preview for next Monday. After our announcements, Mark will continue with the second and final part of his interview with Darrell Edmonds, the Deputy Director of the University of Delaware, on the topic of what's new at the University of Delaware.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 14. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel, and to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. If you want to have a coaching session with Lisa or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Thursday.